G'day, guys. I've just been looking at things that are happening at the moment in the Ukraine sort of area, what's actually happening. Um, I sort of shake my head about really what the hell's going on there. It seems they don't really know what they're doing on the Ukrainian side, or their so-called advisors from the US and Britain and Poland and all these areas. So, it's sort of an interesting development that's actually taking place. They don't seem to be doing what they need to do. They seem to be, at the moment, just getting into a lot of skirmishes for no good reason, rather than actually preparing themselves. Currently, in northern Ukraine, there's probably from slightly halfway between where Kiev is. I'm trying to work out, so just trying to think at the moment. So it's probably part of the way where Kiev is, probably slightly a bit south from there. All that and the northern part, the soil is pretty much frozen at this stage. But beyond that, it's not. And even, have contacts in Greece and actually been looking at some of the stuff that's, and this winter in Greece has been quite mild. So usually what happens is you'll get sort of a lot of cold weather coming down from Russia into the Mediterranean, into the Aegean and all that. And it usually, you get a bit of a cold snap. So that hasn't happened. We're in January and still part of the south hasn't frozen up. So it's still a bit on the soil is still weak. The biggest problem with Ukraine is, as long as the soil is weak, you cannot use like blitzkrieg type attacks with armored vehicles. They just get bogged down. This is what the Germans realized in the Second World War when they were going through the Ukraine. They just got bogged down. So really the Russians are just waiting. I know their political leadership is very frustrated, and actually, but their current military leader, I think, understands this. He's actually a much wiser man and is sort of holding back and saying, no, look, we need to have everything ready. So he's got his additional troops that he needs. He's got his supply lines sorted out. He's got additional fuel, weaponry brought into the area. Pretty much things have slowed down. There's not much movement of many forces. Everybody's been talking about in the West that, pretty much all he's got is T-72 tanks left. He's got a lot of those and all that, but it's not the case. Already in the northern parts and in the eastern part, even in the southern parts, the theaters of T-80 tanks have actually appeared. So they got that wrong. And he definitely kept his best tanks, the T-90s, in reserve. He didn't commit many, very few of those in the beginning. And, the wastefulness on the western side, especially by the Ukrainians, have just wasted a lot of weapons, just firing at anything. And pretty much have expended a lot of munitions, where the Russians only expended a lot of artillery, and they got shitloads, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of artillery pieces. So for them, it hasn't been a very costly war up until this stage. From here on, it probably will become a bit more costlier for them, but they've probably been putting money aside and building up those sort of reserves to be able to use them at the right time. So the whole delay at the moment is that, and still, the Ukrainians are going in and attacking in certain choke points and areas like that the Russians have deliberately left them. And they're actually, even though they outnumber the Russians that are attacking, they're actually sustaining a lot of losses for no good reason, absolutely no good reason whatsoever in these sort of conditions, in bogged terrain, They're not making much of an advance. And all they're doing is occasionally getting lucky with a few HIMAR attacks. What they should have been doing is, through this period, is they should know that by, middle, maybe towards the end of January, that's in the heart of winter. January is the coldest month, and or just at the beginning of it. Eventually, the south will freeze. Once the south freezes, then the Russians can conduct, they've brought a lot of forces there, then they can conduct an all-out blitzkrieg, which they couldn't do before because the terrain is, this is why that's the breadbasket of Europe, the Ukraine. Its soils are deep and they become very muddy. It's really hard to move armored vehicles, as the Germans learnt when they were going through the Ukraine, attacking, trying to get to Moscow and the Caucasus. They realized it was just hard going because of the terrain. It's just, the soils are very soft, very deep brown soils, and they get muddy very easy. They're very much a big problem in traversing when they're really in that sort of state. But once they freeze over, and you can actually see even the Russians are using deep battle theory, which they used in the Second World War. And they're sitting back. They did the same thing outside Moscow. They sort of sat back. All they did was undertake skirmishes with small amount of forces in order to keep the Germans, let's say, guessing game, or off their balance in a sense, which was a smart tactic. And once things froze over, then they pretty much unleashed all hell at that moment. Zhukov, their brilliant military strategist. Actually, the deep battle theory was actually developed by Greek Russian, implemented by Zhukov in that regard. If you want to, I'll probably cover this at some other time in some video about the theory and the person. But getting back to the Ukraine, pretty much the Russians are sitting back and waiting for the right moment to attack. And unfortunately, the Ukrainians are expending a lot of HIMARS and a lot of anti-tank weapons and stuff like that on soft targets. They're using a lot of ammo and constantly asking for more and more. I don't know who's basically, it's whether strategically they are being managed by people outside the country, like Poles or Americans or British, potentially. They don't understand the terrain of the Ukraine. And I think this is the problem we had when in the Second World War, when we relied on the British to defend the middle part, and they collapsed because they did not understand how to secure the terrain. They were told where to go, and they ignored that and allowed themselves open. They were in open terrain, which the Germans were able to just plow through, and their whole defensive positions collapsed. Where the Germans were attacking in Albania with the Italians and couldn't penetrate the Greek lines, but they broke through in the middle where the British collapsed, and they flanked both sides. When you cut off their supplies, obviously you can't fight with stones. The Greeks were willing to fight to the death, and the Germans gave them an option to leave with their military colours and all that. And the only military that never got captured was able to leave the battlefield with their military colours, because the Germans had other things in mind. Operation Barbarossa. They didn't want to be bogged down in the Greek campaign for too long, even though it delayed them by a couple of months, and that's what really stuffed them with their winter campaign in Russia. But that's another story. We sort of got a thanks from Stalin at the time that it helped him out. But in the end of the day, Greeks weren't thinking about helping out Stalin. It was just a consequence of the Germans miscalculating the Balkan conflict on their part, and they paid dearly for it. Better for the free world, I say. So I'm not disappointed with that result. But when it comes to this sort of theatre, I think the West is, I'm not in into supporting, authoritarian regimes. Let me put it. I've put that on the board quite clearly. And what Russia did by invading an independent country is still a violation of international law. I can understand why they were given when you've got an existential threat, you're going to respond like that. The Americans would have done the same thing if the Cuban missiles weren't removed, because that was an existential threat to the US. So I can understand both sides. Of the US, is very disingenuous, the Biden administration. Really, if Trump was in power, this war wouldn't have happened. Simple as that. It's just the Biden, the Democrats are just warmongers and just cannot help themselves, And this undermines the West. It weakens the West. Europe is basically defenseless, more or less. That's the reality. Europe has basically not spent enough, as Trump said, to maintain their own defensive capabilities, and they found themselves in a very weak position. I've talked about this before, about the only credible armies in Europe are the Greek army and the Polish army in terms of numbers of units that they've got to defend. Germany and France are just ridiculous. They've got half the units armored units that these two countries have. It's absolutely ridiculous that they're in that state. But anyway, that's a different story. But getting back to the situation, what will happen is the Russians, once they actually have that, they will come at them with everything they've got. They want to win, and they're going to hit them with everything. This is going to be an absolute blitzkrieg like the Russians did to the Germans, where they found the right time when it was cold, soil was hard, they could actually move large columns of weaponry at very high speed. This is what's going to happen. They're going to roll right over them. So unless a miracle happens, they're going to roll right over them. On the other front, the incompetent West and incompetent Ukrainians in particular are not even preparing for it. They're still trying to attack the Russians in these small little attacks in the south and in the east, and literally are wasting a lot of resources, which they should be conserving for the full onslaught of the Russian military. The way it's going to play out, and I actually put this, I put this in a comment on Douglas's sort of recent video a day ago, and actually, what if I just find it? And I'll actually read it out. And I believe I'm going to be confirmed on this when this happens. I'll just temporarily pause this until I find it. Okay, found it. It's on Douglas Macgregor's The Latest in the War, which was one day ago. And I left a comment there about 4 hours ago, and I said, the Ukrainians are either led by idiots or foreigners who have no idea or history of the fighting in this terrain. The Russians are deploying their traditional deep battle theory as they did against Germany, thinning the Ukrainians out as they do their useless attacks, while the Russians build up their troops and supply lines as they wait for everything to freeze over, the soil that is. A competent Ukrainian leader would conserve their powder, use small forces to harass the Russians and keep them off balance, and remove civilians from the future battlefield, while using the bulk of their forces to lay massive minefields, barriers that would slow down the Russian blitzkrieg attack, and then use himars, anti-armour weapons, and drones to maximize the death rate of the Russians and maybe give themselves a chance of survival as a country and force the Russians into a better peace deal. With the current strategy, I don't see Ukraine surviving the coming Russian attack or onslaught, to be more precise. And that's really my view. It's not that I want to see the destruction of the Ukraine or any country. You know, I'm an Orthodox Christian. They're both Orthodox people, and you know, I weep. You know, and it's not a pleasant thing to see. I know the warmongers loved bloodletting sports, but that's not me. But unfortunately, these people who are leading them are completely incompetent and forced them into a war which they should have never begun in the first place. They had the Minsk agreements. Zelensky himself was voted largely by a Russian-speaking majority, because that's what it is in the Ukraine, and a number of people also in the western part who are real Ukrainians who, you know, because they have a language which is based on the Russian, but it's slightly has some Lithuanian, some Polish elements in, because they were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and kingdoms in the past. They have a lot of common with them. It was just the Russians under the Tsars conquered that part of the land. It's been back and forward. But where the river system is, really the east part has always been part of Russia. The west part has always been part of the Ukraine. This is basically, they've been living now for quite many decades in peace, the two peoples in one country. And unfortunately, we had a person who could hardly speak the Ukrainian language, very poorly, had to learn it. Old Zelensky, he comes from a Russian-speaking background. You know, his parents pretty much were atheists, and so was he. He's been very, very brutal towards the Orthodox Christians, especially the Russian speakers, but even many of the Ukrainians as well that had an independent, you know, sort of breakaway church, and he even banned them. It's ridiculous, you know. So you know, his credibility is down the toilet in terms of, you know, any reasonable person that would look at him. He had a choice. He had signed the Minsk agreements. And pretty much what we found out is what Merkel told us recently. Pretty much it was all a ruse. You know, they found the right man who they provided the right money incentives to do their dirty work. And he pretty much sold out the Ukrainian people, even though he promised them peace and to comply with the Minsk agreements and have peace in the Ukraine. But he did a complete backflip because dollars seem to interest him more than the Ukrainian people. He's got all these villas around the world, and what he's going to do is he's going to walk away from that mess in the not too distant future, and pretty much the Ukrainian people are going to have to deal with the after effects of the destruction of their country, because that's really what has happened. It's all basically the hawks in the State Department and the Democratic Party that basically have this, and the British establishment that have this hatred, pathological hatred for Russia, which is just ridiculous. It's beyond a joke. There's no strategic interest. When you have a strategic adversary, there has to be a reason to have a strategic adversary. Obviously, I don't want Russia to win, you know, personally, because it's not good for the West. It's not good for the EU. It's not good for Europe and all that. But, you know, when you go and do idiotic things, what do you expect? You know, when we listen to idiotic leaders like Biden and like Merkel and all that, that are disinterested in actually doing something to have viable, strong Europe, what happens is you get a disunited Europe because of Merkel and, you know, Biden basically, who is hell-bent on destroying Russia. I mean, really? a nuclear state? You think you could actually destroy them? Are you insane? Are you deranged? Are you deluded? These people seem to be deluded. But it doesn't surprise me when you listen to the woke agenda in the US and Europe, the sort of pathological delusions that these people have. You talk to them and they're deluded on a whole lot of fronts. You wonder, are they sane or not? Whether they need to go and see a psychiatrist or not. It's no wonder these people are prepared to do all this, because it's not their kids on the front line. It's others that are bleeding, not them. If you take a look, even back in the Vietnam War, it was all the politicians made sure their kids didn't go to Vietnam. So it's the same old. These people are prepared to send other people's kids to die for futile wars when there's no reason. Back in the Soviet days, I can understand the West had an existential threat with a competitor that basically wanted to overthrow them. So it was either them or us, in a sense. But that doesn't exist. Russia's not interested. Russia's just interested in basically making sure its borders are secure. That there is no threat close to its borders that can actually affect its national security. Like any country would be concerned about that. Why would you actually exacerbate the conditions and all that? I mean, Putin was quite reasonable. He went in not with a very small force, hoping that he would eliminate the regime and actually then settle things. But, the West decided to go in there full bore, arm the Ukrainians to the teeth and suck him into a war of attrition. It was deliberate. And he got caught out with, being outgunned and outmanned. And still they were able to gain quite a bit of territory. So it shows the superiority of the Russian forces, that you can have 200,000 Russian forces against 800,000 Ukrainian forces, and still they're able to take a large part of the country, which usually they say in military, if you ask any person that understands military affairs, usually the attacking side needs 3 times the forces to defeat a defending side, a well-placed defending side, a well-armed and trained. But obviously, they weren't that well-trained or well-prepared, and lost quite a bit. And now that, the Russians have been building up massive forces compared to the previous forces, now comes the blitzkrieg, and they're not prepared. They have not basically, used that time to build better fortifications, to build minefields, to build a whole lot of, areas to modify them in order to basically secure them or impede the movement of the Russians. Once things freeze over, they haven't done any of that. Complete incompetence is what I call it. I don't know who's leading them, but it's not somebody that's competent. If I can come up with these suggestions, and I am a bit of a reader of military doctrine, so I do understand some of this sort of stuff. I'm not a military person myself. I did want to join the military. My father forced me back to Australia, and he was going to disown me. I should have just joined, but anyway, that's another story, a long time ago. But the reality is I do understand these things quite deeply. I've studied them. I've looked at them, how they were actually employed. I mean, modern features of the deep battle theory were the ones that were actually used in that Second Iraq War. And even one of the actual tactics that would have impressed Alexander was also used by Schwarzkopf, in the armored sort of outflanking the Republican Guard, which was very much something that Alexander would do with his cavalry. So, I'm well aware of these things. And what I've seen in this conflict has been, the Russians trying to avoid killing civilians and trying to avoid, causing a lot of damage and collateral damage and a lot of destruction because they want a viable country. That's all off the table now, because they've looked at it and they said, okay, we tried the soft way to try and actually get the country to change direction and to provide security for these people in the east that are being attacked by Nazis and by quite a few extremist elements within the Ukrainian military. And that's the reality. It's been recorded by many independent journalists. I don't have to say it. You can check them out. The official media won't say anything, but independent journalists have covered this quite well and actually have exposed these things. But there have been some crimes on both sides. That's the honest truth. But that always happens in all wars, you know. But there's not an official policy on the Russian side to harm civilians. That's why they went softly in the first place, to avoid something like that. Where on the other side, it was quite clear that they were trying to, force the Russian speakers out of their homes and across the border. They were trying to basically eliminate the problem by this very aggressive action against the civilians. And that's what increased the hostility of the Russian speakers in the Donbass and other areas, and sort of then forced Russia's hand in a sense. But at the end of the day, still a violation of international law. We've got to be clear about that. But also the other side has not done the right thing by their own people, especially Zelensky, who was voted in specifically to enforce Minsk I and Minsk II agreements and bring peace with Russia. He didn't do that. He exacerbated the situation for the US dollar, apparently. So he put his own selfish interests before his own country that he was elected to represent. So that's why we are where we are now, and that's why we've got this incompetent strategy, because there was no thinking. It was basically, oh yeah, Americans are telling us to attack, to go to war with Russia. That's what we'll do. So it was really, there was no real plan. It was just basically, we'll go to war with Russia, and the Americans are going to give us all the hardware we need to get to damage them. How foolish. Very, very foolish. They were given they've been given massive amounts. I mean, it takes about 3 years to rebuild some of the stockpiles of anti-tank weapons, anti-armour weapons, and a lot of other, equipment that they've been given. Now, obviously, the military-industrial complex loves it in America because they're going to build a whole lot of additional stuff to rebuild those stocks. But as even some of the military in the US have pointed out, we're very low, so, and that's a problem because, yes, you may be able to build new kit, more modern kit, but the downside is, at the moment, if something was to happen in the East China Sea, like Taiwan or whatever, God forbid, but if something was to happen there, you'd be outgunned. You wouldn't be able to send Taiwan very little. If there's a right time for China to move, would be now, because the US is probably 3 years away from actually trying to rebuild those stocks. That's if they don't send any more stuff to the Ukraine. Then they could exacerbate that out to 5 years of actually having to rebuild some of their important infantry weapons. So not looking good on that front for the Western Alliance. And then when you take a look at Germany, about 400 armoured tanks, and France the same, when Greece has got nearly about 1,300, and I think a couple of thousand when it comes to 2 or 3. Most of them are old, probably about a 1.5 that are more modern, that are better, more useful, is what Poland has. Most of the rest of Europe has very little forces, 200 here, 300 there, very little forces. The Russians, luckily, they're not in the Soviet sort of mindset to sort of overrun the whole of Europe with armored forces and all that. They haven't built a war economy. So, because in order to launch an all-out massive war, you have to push your economy to a war economy to be able to lift production and all that. They haven't done that because they're only focused on the Ukraine. They're not interested in going beyond, luckily, for Western Europe and Central Europe and Eastern Europe, because pretty much at the moment, most of those countries are very much, their level of capabilities very small. They've been running less than 2% of GDP, their defense budget, some of them around 1% or less in some cases. So really they've really massively disarmed themselves, and they don't have any real capabilities, let alone they don't have a lot of interoperability. There's a lot of, old equipment, a lot of other systems that don't talk to each other, especially in Eastern Europe, a lot of Soviet era equipment, and in Central Europe, some old equipment and all that. So it's really hard to get coordination as well. So there's a lot of issues in that regard. Obviously, some satellite links and some stuff like that, and localized command posts and all that, maybe you can mitigate some of that sort of stuff, but still there's a lot of problems there. A lot of their armored equipment can't talk to each other. That means they don't have good enough communications within the field. So at sort of battalion and platoon level, there are weaknesses there. Some okay, especially with some of these special forces type things, but outside that, there's a lot of deficiencies there. So there's a lot of problems throughout the military in Europe at the moment. And even the US itself could probably only put about 30, 40,000 people on the field in that regard. I mean, after the Cold War, the US pretty much also scaled back massively to build up to those forces that you'd require. It's just not possible, maybe a decade or more to do that, let alone train people and get them up to a certain standard. It's just a pipe dream. The reality is people need to realize that, we listened to a deranged president who had an ideological agenda and wasn't thinking straight. The Soviet Union wasn't defeated with military arms. You can't win a nuclear war. Russia was defeated by pretty much being outcompeted. But what's happening in the West? We are basically, with a woke agenda, making energy expensive, our manufacturing expensive, and our food supplies and all that have been, completely stuffed up. Europe has lost a lot of its food independence, in particular, energy independence, food independence, and military and defense independence. It's a basket case, to say the least. So it is a mess at the moment. And so windmills and solar farms aren't going to save Europe or North America. What they need is petrochemical products. There's shitloads down in Greece, and they should be starting to encourage the Greeks to get it out and helping them and supporting them when it comes to the revisionist Turks who are creating problems for them. This needs to be sorted out. This sort of bullshit and all that. Qatar now they're putting sanctions on Qatar, obviously, because the Qataris, been doing little funny things. Yes, it's disgraceful what Eva did. So basically, as a Greek, I consider that, because I am a dual national, I consider what Eva did as treasonous in my book. The Qataris are very much pro-Erdogan. They've been supporting the Islamo-fascists in Ankara against the Greeks, and for her to get in bed with this regime is disgraceful. Being a Greek, should be ashamed of herself, So I hope she gets punished by the Belgium authorities for her corrupt behaviour. Yes, so no sympathy from me in that regard. But unfortunately, that's the problem with Western politicians. They don't care about their people anymore. They're all corrupt. They look at, and there's many other Europeans that are, let's not forget how many with the FIFA World Cup, how many Northern Europeans, Germans and others, that were involved in taking funny money. So it's not only in the South, there's plenty of corruption in the North as well. So there's plenty to go around, so to speak. But unfortunately, and in the US, all this funny money with FTX and all sorts of things. It's happening everywhere. The West has become excessively corrupt, excessively, has lost its moral fiber. It's jettisoned faith and embraced woke lunacy and gender lunacy politics. And we're declining. We're dying. in a sense. So we need a revolution in the West to change direction. Peaceful, please, peaceful. But we need to basically kick these pollies out and put in people that are actually not extremists, but people that want to change things. Reasonable people that want to get rid of. And if we don't have any reasonable people, well, why don't you start? If you're a reasonable centrist person, that or follow on my YouTube and you're somewhere in Europe, put yourself down. Set up a group, a local group. You don't need a party. If you've got local group and you get out there and talk to people and tell them, and put reasonable politics. If we get a whole lot of independence in all these parliaments and clear out the old political parties because they're all corrupt, and we clear out all these political people, and we've got a whole lot of independent, reasonable citizens that want to basically take their country back, and actually have it properly run for the benefit of the people of Europe and North America, we could make a lot of changes and improve the world. And we don't have to put up with this nonsense, stupid wars. There's no economic reason, no economic incentive. You go to war because you've got an existential threat. Somebody's threatening your economic and security viability. That's when you've got no option. You have to take action against it. To go to these stupid little wars just so the military-industrial complex can make plenty of money and politicians can get kickbacks from their donors, and destroy whole countries or whole regions of the world, that's not. There's something wrong with our whole system if that's happening. We need to stop this madness, and we need to rebuild our societies. The US doesn't need the military that it's got. They could cut 350 billion out of the budget and reduce it to 350 billion, and they'd still have a credible military, especially if they cleaned up all the funny money and all the kickbacks and all that, and had true competition between the industries and forced them to have competitive pricing. You'd get more bang for your bucks, like happens in some other parts of the world. And on top of that, all that savings could go to infrastructure, new roads, new rail, all this sort of stuff to rebuild the competitiveness of the transport system in the US, to be able to make the movement of goods more cheaper, and the same thing with Europe. And you could put millions and millions of working class people that are now on benefits. So you'd save all that money of the benefits, and you'd actually have productive people earning an income, building infrastructure, building the competitiveness in the system, laying down new cable for high-speed telecommunications and a whole lot of other things. And those people would be taxpayers, not welfare recipients. And there'd be less people on drugs in the US, in Europe, because when they've got a purpose in life, they're less likely to hit the bottle or some drug. Crime would come down. Society would improve overall. We've allowed society to basically degenerate. And, some of our societies are getting closer and closer, moving closer and closer every year towards a systemic collapse. It's not a good thing for our future. This rot has to stop. It really has to stop. The Ukraine is just a symptom of this rot. It's just another victim country, another country that's been destroyed for no good reason. Like Gaddafi's. Now they're having slave markets in Libya. I mean, really? That's the progress? That's the Arab Spring Revolution? Slave markets in Libya? Really? That's how sick the whole system has become. The guy actually gave up all his weapons of mass destruction. He wanted to be friends with the West and all that. And what happened? They knocked him off. So, and they wonder then why other leaders are less cooperative now and telling the US, because they saw what happened to Gaddafi. They saw what nearly happened in Egypt. They saw what happened, in a number of these countries. And they go, are we next? You're forcing them with all this idiocy, regime change mentality, lunacy. What's actually happening is we're forcing all these countries. Look at the Saudis. They told Biden to go, and they're talking to Putin because they're sitting back and they're saying, Putin may not be our best friend, but you know what? He's not going to knock us off. With Biden, with the Americans, we can't be certain. They may knock us off when they don't need us anymore. They're not reliable allies. When somebody becomes an unreliable ally, you're less likely to be, let's say, wanting to help them out when they come knocking the door and asking for more oil and gas for Europe. They're likely to say that rather in a polite way, rather than basically say, yes, our dear friend, close friend, and all that. So that's the reality. I mean, as Lyndon Johnson used to say, when he was asked, why are we supporting this regime? And he said, well, they're our bastards. So he said, as long as they're in the American sphere of influence and not with the Russians, we're going to leave them alone. So not that I agree with the policy of getting into bed with all the nasties of the world, no. But neither should the West be the police dog and mutt of the world either, going around wasting a lot of treasure for very little gain in the long run. Look at the mess in Iraq, still a mess. Look at the mess in Syria, it's still a mess. So or Afghanistan, if they'd actually achieved something, I could say, yep, they're going to achieve something. But they don't even know the art of rebuilding failed states or rebuilding societies. See, when they went into Germany and when they went into Japan, they took control of the country. They didn't hand it over to a bunch of corrupt individuals. In Japan, it was MacArthur who ran the show. He was the supreme leader. The figurehead, the emperor, was just left alone in order not to upset the Japanese. But he had no authority. It was MacArthur. And he took control of the Ministry of Industry and Trade and Technology, MITI as it was called, Ministry of Industry, Trade. Yeah, anyway, can't remember exactly. But that was the ministry that he took over and controlled, and they rebuilt Japan. They had a lot of power until very recently in the history of Japan. So they brought a whole lot of professionals over and changed a lot of the institutions, put a peaceful constitution. I mean, to this day, even the different leaders that have come in Japan, the deep state of Japan that wants to go a bit more militaristic, bring back some of the old stuff and all that, the people are resisting. Why? Because they've had the peace belief so ingrained in them that they are quite hostile to changing that direction. And even the Germans, the West Germans are a bit like that. Where a lot of the radicalism is coming in Germany? From the East, because they lived under authoritarian regimes. For them, it makes no difference. They've lived, it's all the same in that sense. They are more radical. That's how the two Germanys are very different. They're like two different people nearly. That's how separated they have been. They call them Aussies, not Aussies, Australian Aussies, but Aussies, And the reality is, if that's one country that's still very disunited to this day because of the sheer different experience that they live through, and it's really hard for them to sort of, and also to some extent, a lot of the unification was very much mismanaged. Could have been done better. Pretty much the establishment in West Germany wanted a free-for-all to come in and acquire all their competition, just buy everything up. And that built up a certain level of resentment in East Germany. I can understand that. Where if they'd come in and kept the two economies separate, like China did with for instance with Hong Kong, they kept them separate, and slowly over time they integrated them. If they'd done that, they would have given the East Germans enough time to basically reset their economy. They would have kept their own currency, and they would have over time set like Hong Kong's got Hong Kong dollar. They would have set their own currency, and over time they would have adjusted, and they would have been able to integrate much more seamlessly without all that. But the deep state in Germany really wanted to just go in and rape and pillage without any consideration for the local people there. And now Germany's paying for that as a society. Again, because these elites don't care for the people. They create havoc. They are so corrupt and so nasty that they don't think about the consequences. It's all about, if you look at them, they are so disconnected from the rest of societies nowadays that, it's just like, who are you, little ant? In such a society, it's not very good for stability, so to speak. And that's why we need a new independent political class that will tell these elites, start taxing them appropriately and start restricting what they can and cannot do in terms of them being able to manipulate things in the society, and break down their monopoly control to be able to create a real competition where they are stifling it from monopolization. That would make the West a hell of a lot more competitive, and it would mean we would be able to compete with the West would be able to compete with Asia. At the moment, no cheap energy and too much monopolization really makes it very hard to compete. And small, agile businesses, small businesses and stuff like that, to survive in that sort of environment. So the West has got a lot of problems we need to sort out. We've done it before. We've actually broken up big monopolies. We've done things. We've reformed the system to get things working properly. At the moment, we are moving to a rentier society, to a feudal capitalism. If we really want a competitive capitalism, we really need to break up these entities that have become too large and too controlling of the system, and undermining the competitiveness of the West, and undermining also the opportunities for the people in the West. We need to change things. There's a lot of things that we need to change. And if we don't, we will suffer for it severely with reductions in living standards. The living standards will continue declining. And as Klaus reminds us from the wonderful WEF, Klaus reminds us, you'll own nothing. And I'm definitely sure he'll be happy and his friends will be happy, but none of the rest of us will be happy. So we don't want this dystopian future of a feudal capitalism where a small elite control everything and the rest of us are basically left on the side. And unless you actually go into their super cities and 100% controlled, you get nothing. So we're sliding into that abyss at the moment. And if we don't change direction, and violence isn't going to fix it, because they got more military and more arms. And what they will do is they'll use their manipulation methods to make new groups divide and rule, to use them again. So when you go violent, they will just arm a whole lot of groups to kill us. That's not a solution. We need to basically use their own, take away their political control. Really, that's what it is. They have economic control that gives them the ability to control the political system. Once you remove that political control away from them, pretty much they're at the mercy of the people then. And that's when they start behaving themselves. And that's when you can deal with them properly in a legal way in a proper way through peaceful means and get the results we want without literally upending our societies and ending up in massive warfare on the planet. That's the last thing we need as well. If Ukraine has not taught us something, it's taught us that we don't want to go down that path. We want to avoid at all cost such massive mayhem. Anyway, guys, that's pretty much my rant and my thoughts of the Ukrainian issues and the West. I hope it's given you a bit of an insight on what's happening and what's about to happen, and what we need to do as peoples around the world is, and this also goes for populations in Asia and elsewhere that are probably hearing this as well. You need to basically wrest power from these powerful elites, because even in Asia, they are employing the same tech methods to control you and turn you also into, pretty much serfs of a future dystopic world. So it's not only, the West is sort of you could say the experimental animal, but it will, and so is China, but it will end up in a lot of other places around the world. So this goes for everyone. We need to basically build a lot of civilian force, peaceful force, to take control of the political establishment and change the direction of our societies, if we as people are going to have a better future. Anyway, see yous.